Greetings and welcome to Wellspring Community Church. I'm Wendy Musgrave, the pastor of Wellspring, and I am so glad to have you with us this morning. This morning we are continuing on with our worship series called Unraveled, Seeking God When Our Plans Fall Apart. Doesn't that title just resonate right now? This week I went to the dentist for my regular 6-month appointment, which I had scheduled before we had even knew what COVID-19 was. And when my dentist came into the room, he asked me if I had any plans for the summer. Plans? What are those? We are just taking it day by day right now, and that is good enough. Throughout our series, we will be exploring stories of unraveling. These are stories where God meets us in the spiraling, unraveling our plans and us into something new. So this morning, as we begin worship, I invite you to light a candle if you have one nearby. This morning, let's center ourselves, recognizing that we are in the presence of the holy. Slowing down enough to connect with our breath. Focusing our energy as we prepare our hearts for worship. This morning, as we intentionally welcome the light of Christ into our space, may we allow the light to illuminate the shadows in our hearts. May the light of Christ shine in the places where we may be holding anxiety or fear. May the light of Christ warm the places in our hearts that are lonely and feeling isolated. This morning, may the light of Christ be our companion, our guiding force, our healing energy. In the light and love of Christ, let us take a moment just to breathe. To breathe and to listen. To listen for that still, small voice within. Listen. I have a story to tell, a story of a God who longed for justice, a story of a God who pushed back the waters to make dry land, a story of a God who would not take no for an answer when it came to the safety of God's own. For God's people were suffering. God's people were crying out. God's people were shackled and bound by oppression. So God said to Moses, "Speak, let my people go." And Moses spoke over and over again. Moses stood up for justice, but over and over again Pharaoh said no. Power said no. The path of justice is never easy, is it? The path of change is never a straight line, is it? So like Rosa, who sat on the bus, and Martin, who had a dream, Moses kept trying. God kept speaking. Moses kept listening. Hope kept breathing. And when power tried to unravel justice, the people kept dreaming. God longed for justice. God still longs for justice. So let us worship God. For human injustice will never be strong enough to unravel God's dream that all might be free and all might know love. Let us worship holy God. As you may have guessed, our scripture passage for today comes from the book of Exodus, chapter 5, verses 1 through 2, and 7, verses 8 through 23. Afterward, Moses and Aaron went to Pharaoh and said, "This is what the Lord, Israel's God, says. Let my people go so they can hold a festival for me in the desert." But Pharaoh said, "Who is this Lord who I'm supposed to obey by letting Israel go? I don't know this Lord. I certainly won't let Israel go." The Lord said to Moses and Aaron, "When the Pharaoh says to you, 'Do one of your amazing acts,' then say to Aaron, 'Take your shepherd's rod and throw it down in front of Pharaoh, and it will turn into a cobra.'" So Moses and Aaron went to Pharaoh and did just as the Lord had commanded. Aaron threw down his shepherd's rod in front of Pharaoh and his officials, and it turned into a cobra. Then Pharaoh called together his wise men, wizards, and Egypt's religious experts did the same thing by using their secret knowledge. Each one of them threw down his rod and they turned into cobras, but Aaron's rod swallowed up each of their rods. However, Pharaoh's heart was hardened. He wouldn't listen to them, just as the Lord had said. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Pharaoh is stubborn. He still refuses to let the people go. Go to Pharaoh in the morning. As he is going out to the water, make sure you stand at the bank of the Nile so you will run into him. Bring along the shepherd's rod that turned into a snake. Say to him, 'The Lord, the Hebrews' God, has sent me to you with this message. Let my people go so that they can worship me in the desert.' Up to now, you still haven't listened. This is what the Lord says. 'By this you will know that I am the Lord. Now I am going to hit the water of the Nile River with this rod in my hand, and it will turn into blood. The fish in the Nile are going to die. The Nile will stink, and the Egyptians won't be able to drink water from the Nile.' The Lord said to Moses, 'Say to Aaron, take your shepherd's rod and stretch your hand out over Egypt's water, over their rivers, their canals, their marshes, and their bodies of water, so that they turn into blood. There will be blood all over the land of Egypt, even in the wooden and stone containers.' Moses and Aaron did just as the Lord commanded. He raised the shepherd's rod and hit the water of the Nile in front of Pharaoh and his officials, and all of the water in the Nile turned to blood. The fish in the Nile died. The Nile began to stink so that the Egyptians couldn't drink water from the Nile. There was blood all over the land of Egypt. But the Egyptian religious experts did the same thing with their secret knowledge. As a result, Pharaoh remained stubborn. He wouldn't listen to them, just as the Lord had said. Pharaoh turned and went back to his palace. He wasn't impressed, even by this. What a dramatic story. And this is actually just the beginning. It is only a small piece of this story. There are still frogs and lice and flies and boils and storms and locusts and darkness and even the death of the firstborn of all of Egypt to come before the Pharaoh will finally let the people go. What a story. Our passage for today is in the middle of a story that arguably holds the whole Bible together. The Exodus, the liberation of the chosen people, is a defining narrative through which the Israelites define themselves. And then this story grows to serve as a lens through which all future events will be understood. The long-suffering Hebrews for years cried out for deliverance. God had heard their cries, remembered the promises that had been made to their ancestors, and deliverance had arrived. Deliverance arrived in the form of Moses, arguably more of an ally than an insider. Having survived the genocide as an infant, he had grown up in the privilege of the Pharaoh's household and had never been subjected to the oppression and the back-breaking labor that his Hebrew brothers and sisters had been. In many ways, Moses seems to have been uniquely prepared for the job of speaking to the Pharaoh on behalf of God for the liberation of the people. But Moses wasn't so sure at first, and he argues with God a bit. I don't know what I would possibly have to say. I won't have the perfect words. But God reassures Moses that the perfect words are not going to matter. What matters is that you go and that you show up. God reassures Moses that he won't be alone, that Aaron will be by his side, and God will be with them in all of this work. And so Moses and Aaron go to the Pharaoh with God's message, "Set my people free." And the showdown begins. For a lot of this story, it looks as if Pharaoh is unraveling God's plans for deliverance. Moses goes just as God tells him to and demands of Pharaoh the freedom of the people, and Pharaoh will not be moved. In fact, Pharaoh becomes increasingly stubborn and hard-hearted. Pharaoh turns up the pressure on the people he has enslaved, demanding even more and more from them and becoming more and more brutal. God is doing some pretty amazing things through Moses and Aaron, but through all of it, they are met with increasing resistance. Even when it seems that Pharaoh might be taking a bit of a pause, that maybe his resolve was being worn down a bit, his resistance becomes more and more firm. Now, this had to be very discouraging for Moses and Aaron, even if God had warned them about this from the start. Even if they were discouraged, God just kept sending Moses and Aaron back. Tell the Pharaoh, "Let my people go." If for a lot of this story, it looks as if Pharaoh may be unraveling God's work to liberate in this story, ultimately, it is Pharaoh who is undone in the process. Pharaoh is undone by his own fear and greed. He's undone by his hardening grip on his power and domination. Pharaoh is undone by a hardened heart. In this story, Pharaoh's hardened heart has always captured my attention. And I know that I'm not alone in this. The meaning of this hardened heart has been discussed and pondered and wondered about by all different kinds of people for a long, long time. Pharaoh's hardened heart is a reoccurring theme throughout the story of the plagues. God sends Moses and Aaron with a message and equips them with signs and wonders. Something dramatic happens. Pharaoh witnesses something that could have moved him to compassion or empathy. It could have moved him to let the people go, but at each step, his heart is more and more hardened. I've always struggled with this because sometimes it is Pharaoh who hardens his own heart, but at other times the text seems to suggest that God is doing the hardening. This is so intriguing, if not really troubling. What does it say about God if when Pharaoh is teetering, perhaps considering bending or doing something different because perhaps he's seen something that makes him change his mind? Or maybe his resolve is just being worn away, and then God steps in and hardens his heart to bring about the consequences. Why would God harden a heart? Who is God in this story? Who are we? In his book, You Shall Be Gods, Erich Fromm, a German Jew who fled the Nazi regime and settled in the United States, wrote, "Every evil act tends to harden a man's heart, that is, to deaden it. The more man's heart hardens, the less freedom he has to change, the more he is determined already by previous action." Fromm argued that when we harden our hearts, we shut ourselves off from empathy, and that this deadens the effect of our actions. We don't even see the effects sometimes. So in this story, we find Pharaoh in the process of gradually hardening his heart to the point that he causes incredible pain and destruction, not just for the Hebrews, but also for his own people, even bringing about the death of his very own son. The hardened heart didn't happen all at once, but it developed slowly over time until it seems to have eroded any choice that Pharaoh may have perceived in the matter. Rabbi Adina Allen noted that while the hardening of Pharaoh's heart only appears in the plagues, the language of the hardening of the heart appears only in the plagues. When we take a closer look, we can see that Pharaoh's heart had been calcifying long before this dramatic exchange. When the book of Exodus opened, Pharaoh looks out on the Israelites and only sees a threat to his power. He does not see neighbors. He sees threats. If they become too numerous or they become too strong, they will align with my enemies and bring me down. Allen says right here, the hardness of Pharaoh's heart begins to set in as he begins a campaign of fear-based oppression that will ultimately lead to his very demise. Unable to imagine any reality other than us or them, and unwilling to risk vulnerability and uncertainty involved in trying to navigate a mutually beneficial relationship with the Israelites, Pharaoh instead opts for the illusion of certainty and control gained through oppressing others. That certainty at the expense of others is fragile and is eventually unraveled in the Exodus story. As it turns out, the only certainty to be found in this story is that power achieved through oppression and suffering will never last. The God of Exodus, the God of freedom, is not indifferent to injustice, but instead is moving in history, actively unraveling the powerful to set the captives free. And this just isn't an Exodus concept. In the Gospel of Luke, when Jesus is traveling about throughout the countryside of Galilee, sharing the good news, he unrolls the scroll and he reads these words from Isaiah. "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because the Lord has anointed me. God has sent me to preach the good news to the poor, to proclaim the release of the prisoners, to recover the sight of the blind, to liberate the oppressed, and to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. As each new plague turns up the heat, Pharaoh continues to ignore, avoid, shrug off, deny, defy with each and every step along the way. As Pharaoh's heart becomes more and more hardened, his treatment of the Israelites becomes more and more brutal, and Pharaoh sets in motion his own demise. Fromm suggests that there comes a point of no return when man's heart has been hardened and so deadened that he has lost the possibility of freedom, when he is forced to go on and on until the unavoidable end, in which the last analysis, his own physical or spiritual destruction. Abuse of power becomes deadly, not only to the ones who are being oppressed. This story is as much a story of liberation as it is a cautionary tale to the powerful. I notice time and time again when I read this story how much I desperately want to identify with the Hebrews in this story, and I never want to see myself in Pharaoh. Pharaoh is deaf to the pleas of the people. Pharaoh is blind to the suffering of those in bondage within his world. Pharaoh is building his empire on the backs of the Hebrew people. Pharaoh has his focus, his agenda, his nation, his system, his power, and it is all working for him. And he has lost sight of his humanity in the process. Thinking about this week has had me pondering, what about when we get in the way of the freedom and flourishing of others? Right now, we are being confronted with this in our streets. We are being forced to confront the power structures, to turn an eye to the overt and covert ways that our systems stand in the way of the flourishing of our neighbors. If we are honest and self-reflected, we will begin to identify systemic pharaohs, and we will also work to root out the pharaohs within our own hearts. I don't want to be Pharaoh. This week, I've been asking myself, how do I continue to keep my heart soft? How do we avoid hardening our hearts? What is it that hardens our hearts? If it is shame or fear or grief or ignorance that does this hardening, how do we work to unravel these things so that we can be receptive, that we can be open to learning, open to hearing something new from voices that are new to us? We can be open to align ourselves with the liberative nature of God, living into the image of God in which we are all created. I have to admit, I had a really hard time pulling this message together this week. There is so much here. There are so many directions to go, so many questions to ask, so many different angles from which you can approach this narrative. We could spend a lifetime right here in this story and not exhaust this topic. This week, I spent quite a bit of time in a book entitled Stand Your Ground, Black Bodies and the Justice of God by Reverend Dr. Kelly Brown Douglas. She is Dean of the Episcopal Divinity School at Union Seminary, and she's also a leader in the field of womanist theology, racial reconciliation, and sexuality in the Black church. I gleaned a lot of wisdom from this book this week. In the book, she works a lot with the story of Exodus. And for Reverend Dr. Douglas, the Exodus shows us a God that chooses to actively be involved in the world, acting on behalf of the oppressed, because God's preferential option is for freedom. She asserts that God's very identity is defined in a deliverance from bondage into freedom that is life. How true that feels, not only to the story of Exodus, but to the gospel itself. True to Jesus, who came and proclaimed that I came that they may have life and have it abundantly. This book was written in 2015, and in the background of her theological work, she is wrestling with the story of Trayvon Martin. She was invited to be a guest preacher on what turned out to be the Sunday after the verdict came out. And so she was tasked, even through her own broken heart, to speak into the grief of this community. And so today I'm going to close my message by lifting up the words of Reverend Dr. Kelly Brown Douglas as she was writing about the sermon she delivered on that heartbreaking Sunday. I think it is relevant today as she speaks to our identity, not as a region or a nation, but as people of God. This identity, she said, was defined by 5 things. First, there is a strength that comes from God to persist in doing what is the right and just and kind thing to do, despite a world that does otherwise. Second, we are to be thoughtful, thus always looking out for and supporting the rights of another to live fully into who God has called each of us to be, especially in a society that does not necessarily look out for Black bodies. Third, she said, we are to be aware of the life-giving force of God in our lives and never settle on anything that seeks to destroy life. Fourth, she said our identity as people of God meant that we were to always be true to ourselves and to who we are as children of God, and thus not live into the lie that we are less than human. Ultimately, she said we are to live into the truth of God. The truth, she preached, is about the freedom of God. Freedom from those things that would attempt to separate us from the righteousness, the justice, and thus the freedom that God has promised us. Finally, she said that we are always to be engaged in a movement toward life, love, and freedom that is God's for us. She ended her sermon with these words: Church, I don't have to tell you, we are living in disappointing, despairing, if not dangerous times. They are times filled with self-righteous violence and immoral justice. They are times that indeed try our souls because the integrity of our very humanity is in peril. Last night, after the verdict, Trayvon Martin's father said, even though I am brokenhearted, my faith is unshattered. Let our faith not be shattered. Let us be strong, thoughtful, aware, true, and engaged. Let us be a witness to what it means to be a people of faith in a broken world. May the words of Reverend Kelly Brown Douglas be our prayer for today. Amen.
God's gonna trouble God's gonna trouble the water.
Holy Ghost, coming on me.
God's gonna trouble the water.
Wade in the water. Wade in the water, children. Wade in the water.
God's gonna trouble the water.
If you don't believe I've been redeemed,
God's gonna trouble the water.
just follow me down to Jordan Stream.
God's gonna trouble the water. Wade in the water.
Wade in the water, children. Wade in the water.
God's gonna trouble the water. I said, wade in the water.
Wade in the water, children. Wade in the water.
God's gonna trouble the water. I said, God's gonna trouble the water.
As we close our time together today, may the song of creation restore you. May the song of justice infuse you. May the song of heaven enlighten you. And the blessing of the living God, Creator, Christ, and Holy Spirit be with you now and always. Go in peace. Amen.